Alright, welcome back guys. In this part, we're going to start putting together some of our manager classes that we briefly mentioned in the first video when we set up our project. So go ahead and jump into your project and let's open up our managers folder and start creating some files. So in our app, we are going to want three main managers and we're going to create a new file here. And the first one, we're going to go ahead and call it API caller. Now you can go ahead and call it API manager, call it whatever you'd like, but the point is this object is going to be responsible for, you guessed it, calling our API. So let's go ahead and actually, even before we start writing some code in here, let's go ahead and create the other two manager files we'll want. So one more new file. This next one we're going to go ahead and call persistence manager, and it's going to manage basically persistence in our application, so saving the user's watch list and any other caching we'd like to do. The last one here we're going to go ahead and create is going to be a haptics manager. And the haptics manager is going to manage basically playing haptics upon different user interactions in our application. Now let's go ahead and write a little bit of code in each of these just to get them ready for what we're going to want to do. So first up, the most important one arguably, which is our API caller, which is how we're going to get any and all of our data in our application. So we're going to create a final class, going to go ahead and call it API caller. Now we're going to want it to be a singleton so we can access it, the same instance of it, anywhere through our app. So we'll go ahead and create a static property. We're going to privatize the initializer so no one does any funny business. And let's talk about what we want in here. So generally speaking, you want to have some public functions in your manager, and these are going to be things like, get stock info, or maybe search for stocks, and so on and so forth. We'll create those functions iteratively as we continue to build out. We're also going to want some private functions or private components in our object here, which are going to be internal to this API caller class. So this might be things like your endpoints, right? So let's create a enum, and this is going to be our API endpoint. So let's say there is an API endpoint for search. We're going to put all that in here since nobody outside of our API caller really needs to know about the endpoint or what API we're calling. I'm also going to create one more function here, and this one is going to create our URL for a given endpoint, and you'll see why we are doing this as we progress. Basically, it'll simplify the amount of code we have to write and reduce it actually. So we're going to say for endpoints, and we're going to go ahead and also say query params, which is going to be a dictionary of string and string. By default, it'll be a empty dictionary, just like that. And as the name implies, this function is going to create and return to us a optional URL. So let's go ahead and do that. And for now, we'll just go ahead and say return nil here. And we're going to want to fill this out with our different options with our base URL and our different endpoints, but we'll get into that in a later video. The next function I'm going to put in here is a generic way to make API calls, and I'm going to write this out first, and then we will explain the function. So we're going to say private func request, and the request function is going to take in t, which will be codable. And what we want to go ahead and do here is we're going to say perform a request with a URL, which is of type URL optional. And we're going to say expecting t.type. And this is going to have a completion handler. And let me start line breaking some of this so it's a little more legible and nice and organized. And the completion handler of any request is going to be escaping, like so, and it's going to return to us a result. And in the success case of the result, we want t, otherwise we're going to get an error back, and this whole thing returns void. And before we implement this function, let's talk about what the heck this t business is. So essentially, we're going to want to make a variety of API calls, which are network calls to get data from the internet, right? And all of those API calls are going to result in a couple of redundant interactions, right? So we're going to want a URL. We're going to try to reach out and get some data from that endpoint. And once we get the data, if we get it, we want to convert it to a particular type that is codable, which is how you convert JSON into objects, and then we want to return a result. So by using this T-codable thing here, which is a generic, we can actually simplify the times we have to write out that redundant code. So what I mean is the following. So first we're going to want to verify that our URL is not actually nil. So we'll go ahead and do that, and if it is nil, we want to call a failure handler here. Otherwise, we're going to want to create a URL session shared task. And this is going to be a data task with a URL and a completion handler. So we'll pass in that URL. Completion will bring us back data, a response which we don't care about, and an error. Now we're going to want to make sure our data is in fact not nil and our error is nil, aka nothing has gone wrong. Else we're going to return. And down here, we're going to want to try to decode our data to the given type that we are expecting, which is what we have here, expecting. So we're going to go ahead and say, let's result is going to be try to use the JSON decoder to decode expecting from the data. And if we are able to do this, what we want to go ahead and do is we want to return it back to the actual completion handler. So we'll go ahead and say completion here. We'll say success and pass in the results. And in this case, if something has gone wrong and an error was thrown, we're going to say completion. And in here, we're going to drop in a failure and pass back that error. Now, most importantly, a lot of people forget to do this. Make sure you do a task.resume. Super misleading terminology because this kicks off your task. Now, we want to handle a couple more edge cases. Now, if we didn't get data, but we do in fact have a error here, we want to once again call completion and say failure and pass in that error. Now we also want to pass in a error here. We'll say invalid URL. So how do we create our own custom errors? Well, similarly, it wants to be private. Rather, we should make it private, I should say. So we're going to say enum, and this is going to be, we'll say API error of type error, and there's going to be cases that we drop in here. So I'm going to say invalid URL. So now in here, we can go ahead and say call the completion handler with failure. This will be an API error, and there's only one case on there at the moment, which is this one here. And we'll go ahead and also toss this here into the else case, and we'll go ahead and add another case to our API error here, and we're going to say this is a unknown error, or maybe we'll say no data responded, no data received. And let's make sure, let's go ahead and actually call this something else. I don't like no data received. I'll say no data returned, which is why I was considering what to rename this. So let's go ahead and call that here. So instead of invalid URL, in this case, no data was returned. And this is now the code to make any of our API calls. We just pass in a given URL, expecting, and our completion handler. And as we iterate, you guys will see this in action and it will make a lot more sense. But for now, this is our API caller's private functions. One more thing I'm going to toss in here, and I like to do it at the top, and that's going to be a struct, which is going to hold some constants for us. So constants will be things like our API key. It'll also be things like our sandbox API key. And don't worry if you don't understand API keys or what the sandbox business is, we'll talk through it. We'll also want to have a base URL, which is going to be a string as well. And we'll fill this stuff in as we go along, but I think that's enough for our API caller. Let's focus on these other ones here. So persistence manager. So this is going to, as the name implies, handle all of our persistence. So we're going to go ahead and say persistence manager. And just like our API caller, we're going to want to make this a singleton. So I'm going to add a static property called shared, and it's just going to be an instance of our persistence manager. We're going to privatize the initializer. And on here, similarly, we're going to want some private functions, and we are also going to want some public functionality. So what type of functionality do we really want on here? Well, we're going to want things like, add to the user's watch list, remove from their watch list, get their current watch list, etc., etc. So let's just stub some of those out. So we'll go ahead and say we want the user's watch list, and maybe that's an array of strings. And let's make sure we spell this correctly. For now, we'll go ahead and just return an empty array. We're also going to want things in here like add to watch list. So we'll go ahead and say add to watch list. Now we're going to want to pass in some, company or symbol presumably, but for now we'll leave it empty. And we'll also go ahead and say remove from watch list. And what goes in our private? So in our private, maybe we want things like has onboarded, meaning the user has, launched the app more than once, and we'll go ahead and return false. Now you might be wondering, where are we actually going to save all this information? We're going to save it into user defaults. So we're going to go ahead and create private lets. User defaults is going to be of type user defaults, and it's going to be standard user defaults. Similarly to the API caller, I'm also going to toss in a constants struct here, and this constant struct is going to hold a bunch of different constants. That way, if we have strings and whatnot, we don't have to worry about making brittle typos. So that's pretty much it in a nutshell, how our persistence manager is gonna, look from here on out. We're gonna add more stuff to it, obviously, but this is the basic skeleton. Let's go ahead and do our haptics manager, and then we will wrap up. So now this is going to be, once again, a final class. And for those of you who aren't familiar with final, this term basically means that no other class in our project can subclass haptics manager, or anything that's final for that matter. So we'll go ahead and create our haptics manager here. We're going to privatize the initializer, and we're going to want, in this case, no private functionality, but we will want some public functionality. We'll also want to go ahead and import UI kits into this manager, and we'll just go ahead and stub out one function so you guys can get a glimpse of what we're going to do in here. We're going to say public func vibrate for selection, and basically we are going to want to vibrate lightly for a selection tap interaction in this function. Now we're going to want another function here later on as well. This is going to be vibrate for type, and we'll go ahead and build this out once we get to, integrating our haptics and making everything feel really, really nice and premium. So that's all I've got for the managers. We've got a good skeleton, especially for our API caller, where we are going to spend quite a bit of time. Let's go ahead and wrap this up here, and I'll see you guys in the next part.